Question number 2, Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, what reports has he received on dairy prices and their effect on the New Zealand economy?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, members will have seen the results of the recent dairy auction. International dairy prices now around 40% lower than the recent peak in early March, and there are indications it could fall further. For the dairy sector, of course, times are turning out tougher and perhaps for longer than industry experts were forecasting and more than the government was forecasting earlier this year. The dairy sector makes up 5 to 6% of the economy, taking into account associated service industries. So obviously a fall in prices of this magnitude on a sector that makes up around 20% of exports is going to have a flow-on effect to economic growth.
Order. Supplementary question, Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How is the fall in dairy price impacting on other sectors of the economy?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, lower dairy prices will obviously impact on businesses with links to the dairy sector. It's somewhat mitigated by the fact that dairy farmers still have to spend a certain amount of money to achieve their output. Unfortunately, some of that spend in the next 12 months will be financed by debt rather than by revenue. Offsetting this somewhat is the recent fall in the exchange rate. The exchange rate is down around 25% against the US dollar compared to this time last year. That, of course, will support all exporters by softening the impact of lower prices on the dairy industry, but underwriting more profitability for other export sectors like meat and wool, horticulture, ICT and tourism, all of whom are doing well and whose competitiveness has been strengthened by the lower dollar. An important continued part of the success of the export industries are our free trade agreements with Taiwan, for instance, and we expect significant benefits from the FTA with Korea, which we hope to have in place this year.
Supplementary question, Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How does the resilience of the New Zealand economy compare to when the government first came into office in 2008?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, New Zealand is always going to be subject to international pressures because we are a small, open economy. However, we have become a fairly resilient one. Alongside the automatic adjustments of flat to lower interest rates and a lower exchange rate that I mentioned earlier, New Zealanders have been strengthening New Zealand's balance sheet. Household savings rate is now positive consistently for the first time in 25 years. Offshore debt has reduced by 20% of GDP since 2009. The net international investment position has improved from -85% of GDP to -64% of GDP. And the current account continues to outperform forecasts, currently sitting at 3.6% of GDP. And of course, the government is heading towards surplus and the beginning of paying off its own debt.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, if the Minister believes what he has just told the House, that auction prices are down 40%, that they could fall lower, and those prices could remain low for considerably longer.
Can I have the question, please?
Why does he believe that it's economically sensible for his government to block dairy exports to our world's second largest dairy importer, that being Russia, when our rural and provincial communities are in such dire straits? Or are they expected to just carry the load?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not absolutely clear that a change in the situation in Russia would make a material difference to the current dairy prices, but ongoing discussion with a range of nations trying to deal with the challenging behaviour from Russian leadership will continue. When there is an opportunity for dairy exports to resume there, then I'm sure that opportunity will be taken.
Supplementary question, Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How does the forecast of New Zealand's expected economic growth compare with the growth in previous years?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, New Zealand's economic growth over the last 4 years averaged 2.6% per year. The Reserve Bank said today that the growth outlook is now softer than they expected in their last forecast 6 weeks ago, but I'd note that those last forecasts included a substantial reduction in dairy prices, but still projected a growth of around 3% for the next couple of years. And I expect the Reserve Bank will update its forecasts in another 6 weeks' time. So although expectations of growth may be coming back a bit from recent forecasts, low interest rates, higher construction activity and high net immigration indicate that we are on track for solid, moderate and sustainable growth for New Zealanders, which will underpin more jobs and higher incomes.
Question number